Dawn breaks over a quiet plain dusted in mist. A few early birds stir in the tall grass. Near the edge of a small cliff, a band of humans emerges from a shallow cave. No buildings, no farms, no writing. Just people, stone tools, and a planet that changed faster than they could prepare for. We'd call them cavemen, but that word flattens everything. It turns them into grunting stereotypes. The truth is harder, messier, and more impressive. Because these people didn't just survive in the wild, they invented survival as we know it. One stokes a low fire, coaxing embers into flame. The real Paleolithic life didn't follow strict gender rules. You could spend 3 days following a herd and come back empty-handed. That's why plant knowledge was everything. In Israel es Gesher Binat Yaakov, site dated nearly 800,000 years ago, remains show incredible knowledge of seasonal plant cycles. People knew what grew where, when it ripened, how to crack it open, how to cook it. This wasn't luck. This was memory passed down across thousands of generations. Everyone gathered. Everyone hunted, depending on the season, the game, and the urgency of hunger. No sunglasses. No shade unless you made it. The heat slowed everything. If a hunt succeeded, the animal had to be butchered quickly, the meat smoked or dried, bones saved for tools. Every part mattered. You didn't waste fat or sinew or marrow. The oldest known pigment workshop at Bombo's Cave in South Africa is almost 100,000 years old. That means they weren't just thinking about food. Tools weren't optional. You needed scrapers for hides, awls for leather, spears for hunting, grinders for seeds. The old Dowan tools, simple chipped stones, evolved into the Laval-Way technique, where people shaped cores precisely to get flakes they wanted. Later, in the Upper Paleolithic, came true engineering. Burins for engraving, needles for sewing, harpoons for fish. And these weren't accidents. They were products of minds that learned by doing and failing thousands of times. They were thinking about meaning. An elder could die, taking a lifetime of knowledge with them. They cooked if they could. They shared what they had. Around the fire, stories flowed. Kids learned by watching, imitating, failing. Old people taught by showing how to hold a tool, how to follow tracks, how to wait. There was no school, but there was education. There was something else, something more human. People even cracked long bones to get the inside grease that kept children from starving during winter. This wasn't a world of cruelty and endless rejection. We have skeletons of people who lived decades with deformities, broken bones, even blindness, people who clearly couldn't hunt or forage alone. That means someone fed them, someone carried them. Compassion wasn't modern, it was ancient. They carved bone flutes. One found in Germany dates back over 40,000 years, playing notes we still recognize. They beat on logs, sang around fires, and taught children how to listen. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was memory, bonding, maybe even prayer. There's archaeological evidence from multiple sites, including Schedingen in Germany, of collaborative hunts involving complex wooden spears balanced for throwing. In places like Chauvet and Lascaux, cave walls explode with animals, bison, reindeer, lions etched with incredible precision. These weren't decorations, they were stories, field guides, maybe warnings, maybe magic. These tools weren't clumsy sticks, they were carefully crafted, shaped to fly true. Autumn meant collecting nuts and drying meat. Winter was hunger, cold, risk. The best bands planned for it. They dried strips of meat, dug pits into cooler earth, smoked fish. In colder regions, snow itself became storage. In places like Mazyrik in Ukraine 15,000 years ago, people even built homes out of mammoth bones, circular shelters, sturdy against wind and snow, roofed in hide. It wasn't just survival. It was architecture. People planned, they tracked, they failed. A lot. Another checks the ground, reading faint prints in the mud. There are no alarms, no calendars, no morning routine. There's just the cold, the world, and the question, how do we survive today? This was the Paleolithic world, an era that spanned nearly 2.5 million years, over 99% of human history. So what did they actually do all day? It starts with light. They woke up with the sun, not because they wanted to, but because darkness was dangerous. Fire didn't last forever, and predators didn't wait for invitations. Water had to be fetched, probably from a stream a mile or two away, carried in gourds or animal bladders. People split into small task groups. Some would scan for edible plants. Others would check traps or follow trails of scat and broken branches. The rhythm was always the same: search, assess, adapt. Evidence from sites like Terra Amata in France, dated to 380,000 years ago, shows hearths carefully placed and rebuilt over and over. Fire wasn't just a source of heat, it was a shield. If the flames went out, everything else became urgent. Morning was for checking the essentials. Is there wood for fuel? Did the wind scatter our shelter? Are there animal tracks, nearby predator or prey? Are we running out of food? Are we safe? And then the work began. Forget the cartoon image of men with spears and women picking berries, because hunting wasn't a daily victory. It was a gamble. By midday, the sun beat down hard. There were no umbrellas, and winter? It was a slow-motion war. Seasonal cycles shaped everything. Spring brought eggs, new growth, young animals. Summer brought berries and sun-scorched walks, and yet even then, nothing lasted. A storm could tear it all apart. A herd could vanish, but in between the survival, people made music. They made art, not just scribbles, but deliberate works. They painted, carved, tattooed, and shaped symbols we're still trying to decode. And always, there were tools. Every evening was a reset. As the sun sank, everyone came together, and there was care. Night falls fast without electricity. The fire crackles low, casting long shadows on the shelter wall. There are no street lights, no glow from windows, only the moon and the darkness beyond it. You stay close to the flame. The silence of night isn't peaceful, it's loaded. A snapped twig outside could be a hyena, or worse. You don't sleep alone. You don't sleep deeply. You listen. This is when memory speaks loudest. Someone tells a story. Maybe it's about the hunt. Maybe it's about the river that dried up 3 summers ago. Maybe it's about the man who walked too far and never came back. But it's not just talk, it's instruction. Stories weren't optional. They were survival manuals disguised as entertainment. Around the fire, knowledge moved from old mouths into young ears, shaping minds without paper or ink. In fact, they might have been sharper than us in all the ways that mattered back then. Their brains were just as big, sometimes bigger. But more importantly, they were present. They read the wind like we read texts. You don't know which plants in your neighborhood are edible. You don't know how to sew leather, make fire, read tracks, or filter water without gear. You've got intelligence, but not theirs. They knew bird calls, the snap of branches, the weight of clouds. They could tell what animal passed by from a disturbed leaf. They tracked prey for days through shifting terrain. Their teeth, while worn, show fewer cavities than later agricultural people. Their diet was diverse: berries, roots, nuts, wild greens, honey, fish, insects, meat. They ate what the land offered, and they knew when to move before it stopped giving. They lived in full sensory awareness, because distraction got you killed. As if the answer is nothing, they're missing everything. You moved constantly, sometimes hundreds of miles a year, chasing herds, following weather, fleeing danger. They hunted. They cooked, carved, stitched, wove. They taught and learned. Language? They breathed it into being. Cities, civilization, spaceflight, all built on the backs of people who spent every day watching the sky, boiling bark for tea, and hoping they'd live long enough to see tomorrow. They danced and sang, they tracked and traded. They healed and grieved. They remembered. The idea of a home was fluid. Shelter wasn't a place, it was wherever you could survive long enough to rest. People carved figures from ivory goddesses, animals, unknown beings. They buried their dead with care, sometimes covered in red ochre, sometimes laid with tools or beads. In Sanjir, Russia, 2 children were found buried head to toe in ornaments. Over 10,000 mammoth ivory beads sewn into clothes. But compared to later eras like early agricultural societies, mass graves and conflict appear less frequent. Why? Probably because they were mobile. If things went bad, you left. You didn't defend borders. You relocated. That takes hundreds of hours. You don't do that by accident. That's not survival. That's ritual. That's belief. This was the school. This was the internet. This was the archive of a people with no books but lifetimes of lived experience. A broken ankle might be a death sentence. Giving birth, terrifying. Losing a child, common. Your best odds weren't being the strongest or fastest. They were being part of a band that shared, remembered, adapted. Your world was filled with wonder, but it was also sharp, cold, wild. There was no backup plan. Only people. Each other. And then sleep. If you're lucky, it's dreamless. If you're unlucky, the fire dies out, and the cold creeps in. Trade routes stretched for hundreds of miles. Tools made of flint or obsidian appear thousands of miles from their origin, meaning ideas and items moved long before wheels or writing. There wasn't one band, one cave, one genius. There was a network, a human web that spanned continents. And tomorrow, it begins again, because nothing about Paleolithic life stood still. Every season brought change. Every hunt shifted territory. And still, somehow, they made culture. The Upper Paleolithic saw more than just better tools. It saw a symbolic explosion. They cooperated across groups. And they weren't brutes. They weren't dumb. Compare that to now. You don't know which direction your house faces. You don't know what phase the moon is in. They didn't have comfort, but they had competence, and that's what kept them alive. They weren't constantly starving either. Skeletal analysis shows Paleolithic humans were surprisingly healthy. Their bones are dense. And yes, violence existed. Some skulls show trauma. Some sites suggest warfare, but that doesn't mean it was easy. Weather shifted fast. Ice ages came and went. Diseases spread. Injuries ended lives. And that's the thing we forget. This wasn't individualistic survival. It was group survival. Even a firekeeper mattered. Even a story mattered. So when people say, "What did cavemen even do all day?" They gathered. They lived. And not just for one day, but for nearly 2.5 million years. They survived volcanic winters, predatory beasts, changing continents, and the slow invention of everything we now take for granted. Agriculture? They laid the groundwork. So the next time you hear the word caveman, don't think of a grunting brute in a fur skirt. Think of an innovator with no blueprint. Think of a child learning to scrape hides by firelight. Think of a woman who tracks deer better than any man. Think of a father carving the same mark his father made in stone 10,000 years before. Think of people, because they weren't primitive. They were human, just like you, only tougher. Part of what made Paleolithic life so powerful was its unpredictability. One day you might find an abundance of fish in the river and the air full of birdsong. The next, the river could be dry, the birds gone, and a predator's tracks circling your camp. There were no guarantees. There were only patterns, and even those shifted with time and weather. But despite the chaos, people learned. They read the land like a living text, one written not in ink, but in mud, ash, cloud, and scent. A twisted ankle during a hunt could leave you stranded miles from help. A sudden storm could flood a valley, drown a shelter, scatter everything. But people learned how to prepare. They developed poultices from plants, binding wounds with bark and fiber. The foundation of all modern languages was laid around fires, in forests, beside rivers. Proto-languages may have been regional, even tribal, but they allowed cooperation on a level unmatched by any other species. People didn't just warn each other of danger. They watched, walked, hunted, gathered, taught, learned, led, healed, laughed, feared, created, adapted. They navigated the edge of extinction for 2 million years without cities, without factories, without smartphones. They didn't have modern science, but they lived in constant observation. They didn't have modern medicine, but they healed with what they knew. They didn't have modern language, but they told stories that echoed for generations. Their lives were fragile, but not empty. Their world was dangerous, but not dull. Their challenges were relentless, but not meaningless. Every day was a test. Every day was a lesson. Every day was a thread in the massive tapestry of human evolution. They described, they reminisced, they speculated. That means Paleolithic humans didn't just react to the world, they imagined futures, replayed pasts, and invented possibilities. They asked questions, even if they didn't have words like why or how. That ability to question, to wonder, to reflect is what made us human. And it was born not in cities, but in caves, huts, and grassy clearings. They set bones. They chewed leaves to dull pain. The positioning of bodies in graves, the use of red ochre, the inclusion of grave goods, all suggest a belief in something beyond this life. Maybe it was an afterlife. Maybe it was a return to the land. Maybe it was a memory, but whatever it was meaningful. These people didn't see death as a disappearance. They saw it as a transformation. They mourned, they honored, they remembered. Archaeologists have found evidence of healed fractures, long-term disabilities, and even missing limbs, proof that others must have carried and cared for those who couldn't care for themselves. Compassion wasn't an invention of modern society. It was part of our DNA, and it was functional. A tribe that discarded the weak was a tribe that lost knowledge. Elders knew the land. Injured people could teach children. A grandmother who could no longer hunt might remember the location of a spring that hadn't run dry in years. Every person mattered. And in that way, survival wasn't just about bodies, it was about memory, story, and community. They didn't just notice change, they studied it. They remembered that the elk passed through the valley in early spring. As ice sheets advanced and retreated, bands migrated. Some crossed frozen land bridges into new continents. It was filled with beauty, wonder, and joy, the kind that comes from a perfect hunt. From watching the stars beside a fire, from hearing your baby laugh for the first time. Without light pollution, the night sky was vast and overwhelming. People looked up and saw patterns, some of which still bear the names we gave them tens of thousands of years ago. The first constellations weren't named with telescopes, but with hope, fear, and imagination. The stars were a calendar, a storybook, and a mystery all at once. People sang to them, prayed to them, and mapped them. Navigation wasn't done with compasses. It was done with memory and starlight. Others followed animal herds across plains, coastlines, and mountains. Every migration was a gamble. Would the next valley offer food or famine? Would the river be passable or frozen? Would the air bring spring or sickness? But this constant motion also meant constant adaptation. People learned how to survive in deserts, jungles, tundras, and forests. They fashioned sandals for rocky terrain, cloaks for cold nights, baskets for wet climates. The first shoes made of bark and hide were not fashion, they were tools. The first shelters built from mammoth bone and hide were not primitive, they were architecture. People weren't helpless wanderers. They were mobile engineers. They remembered which direction the sun set when the berries ripened. They remembered that one patch of ground near the bend in the river always made people sick, and they stopped drinking there. In a world without maps or textbooks, memory became the most important tool. And unlike a spear or a scraper, memory was something you passed from mouth to mouth, person to person, across generations. Even leisure, when it appeared, had purpose. People didn't take the day off. There was no such concept. But there were moments of relief, especially after a successful hunt or during seasons of plenty. These were the times when culture blossomed. People painted not just on cave walls, but on themselves. They wore beads, necklaces, body paint made from ochre, charcoal, and crushed minerals. They danced, sometimes in circles, sometimes alone. They drummed, sang, and clapped. They imitated animals, mimicking the way a bison moved, the way a bird called, the way a fox crept. These weren't just performances. They were spiritual acts, educational tools, and community rituals all at once. When a child danced like a bird, they learned the bird. When an elder chanted a story, they taught survival, morals, history, and fear. These moments weren't extra, they were essential. They reminded everyone why they endured. They reminded everyone who they were. Childhood in the Paleolithic world was short in years, but vast in responsibility. There was no protected bubble of youth. Children were expected to observe, to imitate, to contribute as soon as they were able. A 5-year-old might carry firewood. A 6-year-old might help collect eggs or roots. By 10, you might be practicing with a spear. But this didn't mean a joyless existence. Childhood was learning and motion learning to balance, to read tracks, to identify poisonous berries, to recognize the tone of someone calling out in fear versus surprise. Children played, yes, but play was survival in disguise. When they threw stones, they were practicing aim. When they stalked each other in games, they were rehearsing for hunts. And always there were eyes watching, parents, aunts, uncles, elders, quietly guiding, correcting, praising. The tribe raised a child, and in doing so passed on a living legacy of skills and knowledge that had no written record, but infinite value. Even with all this knowledge, danger was never far. A single bad cut could become infected. The rhythm of Paleolithic life was seasonal, cyclical, and always moving. The Paleolithic world was not uniformly grim. Communication may have started as grunts and gestures, but it evolved into rich, layered systems. Religious and spiritual belief, though impossible to fully reconstruct, left traces as well. So when people ask, what did cavemen actually do all day? The real answer is this. They did everything. They weren't waiting for the future. They were building it. One scraped hide, one flint flake, one whispered story at a time.